Is this on? Yeah. Good evening and welcome to tonight's segment of the Faculty Lecture Series. If you don't know who I am, I'm Jessica Lardy. I am professor and director here and I coordinate the series. So thanks for attending tonight's lecture. Keep an eye out for my upcoming lecture announcements or grab a rack card on the way out from tonight. Our next lecture is tomorrow. Featuring Professor Brittany Harlan and Dr. Kyle Glenn from the School of Business. This evening's event is presented by Dr. Jane Olivia St. Onge from the School of Business. She is an adjunct professor. She earned her undergraduate degree in business from Columbia Southwestern University in Alabama, 2 master's degrees, the first in curriculum and instruction, and the second in special education from Colorado Christian University. She continued on and earned an MBA in public administration and finance from Adams State and a PhD in organizational leadership from Johnson University. Tonight's lecture is titled Exploring Special Education Teacher Turnover in Colorado's Title I Schools, a Phenomenological Study. And in her words, the purpose of this qualitative study was to explore the factors contributing to teacher turnover among special education teachers in mild to moderate need classrooms within Title I schools in the Pikes Peak region of Colorado. The study aims to understand their lived experiences and identify key elements influencing their decision to leave their positions. By adopting the Brannell and Smith conceptual model for teacher retention, the insights gained from this research may inform policy development and practice improvements for educational leaders seeking to enhance teacher retention and support in similar educational settings. Despite efforts to address this issue, novice teachers, especially those in the field for less than 3 years, are leaving at an alarming rate due to the stress associated with their roles. Understanding these factors can guide the creation of strategies and to alleviate stressors, enhance support systems, and promote the retention of qualified special education teachers. So help me in welcoming Dr. St. Onge.
Hey everyone, my name's Jane St. Onge, or Dr. St. Onge. Thanks for coming tonight to kind of look at my presentation and talk about this research with me. First, we'll kind of talk about what this presentation is going to look like. We'll do an introduction to the research problem. We'll go over the purpose of this research, my research questions that guided my research, the methodology used, the data collection and data analysis methods, the key findings and implications and significance of this research, and then my ideas and recommendations for implementation in future research. The purpose of this qualitative phenomenological study is to explore the factors contributing to turnover among special education teachers in mild to moderate classrooms in the Title I schools of Pikes Peak region. I specifically wanted to look at the Pikes Peak region because the Front Range has a wealth of schools and a wealth of districts that have a high turnover. The schools publicly publish their turnover rates from year to year, but they don't publish the information the same across the board. So sometimes you'll look at teacher retention in one district, and that teacher retention will talk about teachers that left the school, whereas other districts will consider teacher retention teachers that changed positions. So when you look at the district's depiction of what teacher retention looks like for them, it doesn't necessarily carry the same from district to district. So for instance, in the districts in the Pueblo area of the Pikes Peak region, they tend to consider changing from one position to another, still retaining that teacher, because they may have left the mild to moderate needs classroom, but if they go into general education, they're still a retained teacher. But if you look more towards the Front Range and the Colorado Springs districts, if those teachers change positions, then we are losing them from this field of special education. So I really wanted to dig into how we're defining retention, as well as how we're defining it within the context of each special education setting. So the problem that kind of also guided this research is that retaining special education, experienced special education teachers in the mild to moderate setting can't be overstated. Teachers Special education teachers support students with diverse needs in mild to moderate settings, ensuring that their academic progress and social and emotional development needs are met. Problems include rapid teacher turnover, the growing number of students, and the impact of attrition on educational quality and administrative leadership. I want to highlight this last sentence here. Rapid teacher turnover it's a big problem, especially in special education. Some studies cite as high as 70%. Teachers within their first 5 years in special education sometimes have up to a 70% turnover across the state of Colorado. So it's relatively alarming. But as we look at special education diagnoses like ADHD, autism, or any other kind of outside diagnosis, it doesn't always lead to the identification of a student being special needs. Sometimes it'll lead to a 504, but there is a problem with overclassification where the states get paid for classifying students as special education, and we tend to overclassify. So it's kind of something that's definitely worth looking into as the growing population of students since COVID has grown substantially. It was something I wanted to really look at with this research. And then the impact of educational quality. Special education is very relationship-based. You can talk to any special education teacher. They will be able to tell you a wealth of information about the kids on their caseload. So when that teacher leaves, it has more than just an impact on that student. It has an impact on the students around them. And then when we replace that teacher with a new teacher, it takes time before we get back to learning academics because we have to get to learn the student again. We have to get to know their needs, and we have to build that relationship with them in order to get to that next stage of actually teaching. So some existing gaps in the examination of the special education teacher retention is the mild to moderate classroom. There are high rates, especially in Title I schools that have large low-income populations, and it hasn't fully been researched. Colorado specifically struggles with filling these positions, though it is similar to national trends. We do have vacancies every year that go unfilled. There are a lack of studies that differentiate between the different areas of special education. And this is something I found very eye-opening in my own research. When you look at special education across the board, it's not classified the same. Mild to moderate does not look the same in one district as it looks in the other. Affective needs does not look the same in one district as it looks in another. When you get to programs like SSN, they usually are pretty similar across the board. But the classification of what we're calling mild to moderate is not the same across the board. And in my own research, I found that to have quite a big impact. So research questions that guided this research. I had 3 research questions. One fell into the microsystem, the mesosystem, and the exosystem in the Brownell and Smith conceptual model. My first research question was, what personal factors contributed to special education teachers leaving mild to moderate needs classrooms? My second research question was, what inter-school factors contribute to special education teachers leaving the mild to moderate needs classroom? And then lastly, what societal factors contribute to it? So I looked at the 3 different layers. I looked at internal factors within the school, I looked at personal factors, and then I also looked at societal factors, which kind of covers that overclassification. My study design was a phenomenological study. The Brownell and Smith conceptual model for teacher retention was the major framework that I used to conduct this research. I used a phenomenological approach through semi-structured in-depth interviews that I conducted virtually. And then my sampling was 2-pronged. I did do snowball sampling, and then from the applicants that came in, I did purposive sampling to ensure that they met my requirement for the research. The Brownell and Smith conceptual model for retention looks at these 3 systems that guided my research question. The microsystem focuses on individual teacher characteristics and dynamics in the classroom. A lot of this looked at what made you want to enter special education and what wasn't working enough for you to decide to leave special education. In the mesosystem, I looked at the school environment. A lot of this revolved around administrative support. Some of it touched on professional development. Many of my participants cited school culture. There are a number of students on a caseload, and how appreciated they felt during their time as a special education teacher. My exosystem, which is the third tier of the Brown Allen Smith conceptual model, looks at societal influences like government policies, community support, and socioeconomic conditions. And kind of as we go through this, you'll see how these areas guided a lot of the questions that I asked in my in-depth interviews, but all of my participants kind of came to their own conclusions of where they took this. So not everyone considered external factors for social influences like government policy and community support the same. Some of my participants looked at community support and felt like overclassification was the problem. Other of my participants felt like they had great support in one area and then moved to another and had nothing but problems. So my sample criteria and size for this research, I had to narrow it down through my research pool and through my process. I looked at participants who recently departed the special education setting in mild to moderate classrooms for the Pikes Peak region. Partly I wanted to look at participants that left the field but left recently. When I initially pulled my candidate pool, I was assuming that I would find a lot of participants that left the mild to moderate setting and transitioned to general education, or I thought I would find participants that left the field altogether for a different industry. Because if you think about teachers in special education or in any educational setting, you go to school, you get a bachelor's degree, you get a master's degree, and you decide, okay, this is what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna teach special education. But the things that caused them to leave weren't significant enough for them to leave special education as a whole. So in my own research, the sample that I ended up with through my sampling method is not the sample that I thought I would, which was kind of eye-opening to me. I opened my candidate pool initially for 5 to 7 participants, but I did have difficulty finding participants who wanted to openly speak about their experiences. And kind of when we get to that portion, I think you'll start to see why a lot of my participants had difficulty talking about their experiences in special education. My participants were selected based on specific criteria relevant to the study, which is that having left the field within the last 5 years, having been in their position for at least a year, and having taught in a mild to moderate setting. My recruitment strategy was the two-pronged approach for snowball and purposive sampling. My inclusion criteria was former special education teachers who taught in a mild to moderate needs classroom in the Pikes Peak region that have left within the last 5 years. I initially sent emails to what I like to call gatekeepers. So for me, my emails went to district coordinators, district leadership, friends that I have within the special education setting across the state of Colorado, because as special education teachers move and they leave, some of them have military spouses, they go to another state, but they still have plenty of people that they know that teach within the district in the area that I was looking for. Once my gatekeepers received my recruitment email, they spread it out to everyone that they know, or everyone that they knew that they thought would qualify. Participants then accessed the link, which took them to my informed consent. I reached out, we confirmed their participation, and then scheduled virtual interviews. And then all of my data was stored within my university's OneDrive. My data analysis, the purpose was to uncover the essence of turnover among these teachers in their mild to moderate settings. I identified the key statements and quotes from each interview, and I manually coded all of the interview data from the transcribed interviews. Initially, I highlighted the significant statements that seemed very impactful across each of the systems within the Brown Allen Smith conceptual model. Then I redefined broader themes and relationships and developed codes and themes that kind of fit the narrative from one person to another among all my interviews. This is something I think really shaped my research. The context of mild to moderate settings is not the same from district to district. When you look at research about special education is generally lumped together. We talk about special education teachers leaving, problems in special education. administrative problems in special education, but we never really define what subset of special education we're talking about. So in many districts, you'll have an SSN room, which is students with severe needs. You'll have a mild to moderate setting, which is students who have mild to moderate needs. Some districts will have an effective needs program. Some districts will have a behavior program. Some districts will have an autism program that has different requirements for what qualifies students for these programs. And the reason why I think this is really important to talk about is because it's not the same. When you look at Pueblo and how they run, the two districts in Pueblo run special education, their mild to moderate setting teachers have a lot of students that have behavior. They have a lot of students on their caseload that have an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis outside that is impacting them in the school setting. But they're not put into a center-based program to support those needs. For a variety of reasons across the districts, they have control over how they categorize students into each of these categories of special education settings. So what I found in my research was that the context of how one district describes special education to another greatly impacted these teachers' experiences as I went through my interviews. Effective needs programs in some districts serve students with severe emotional disabilities, which we call SED, in center-based settings, which means they're in a least restrictive environment or an LRE of 40 to 70%. A lot of our rural districts do not have dedicated programs for placing these students, so they land in a mild to moderate setting, which means you have teachers who had no intention of working with students that have high behaviors or violent behaviors, working with students that demonstrate these behaviors and impact their ability to teach. So if you hire someone to be a mild to moderate teacher, they generally expect that most of the time they're going to be teaching reading, writing, or math, your core subjects in the elementary level. And then in the secondary level, it looks a little different because sometimes they co-teach or the model looks different. But what I found in my research was that many of my teachers didn't know what they were getting into when they took a position in mild to moderate because of what it looked like in one district where they did their student teaching compared to where they took an actual position in. So again, the impact on educators for understanding this difference is that this inconsistency influences teacher roles, workload, and job satisfaction. We always kind of want to know what we're getting into before we get into it. As a special education teacher, you know if you take an SSN position, it's going to look different than an autism position. It's going to look different than a mild to moderate position. But a lot of these teachers weren't aware of that because of how they were licensed and their process to becoming a teacher. My participants varied. My participants' backgrounds, all of them remained in special education, with the exception of one of my participants left the mild to moderate setting for an administrative position. So to my surprise, every teacher that left the mild to moderate setting picked a different niche area of special education or a subset area rather than continuing to teach rather than leaving special education and transitioning to general education, which is where I thought my research would have led me, but it's not. 60% of my participants were between 30 and 39, and the other 40 were between 40 and 49. 60% of my participants were female and 40% were male. 60% of them held a master's degree, while only 40% of them held a bachelor's degree. More on my participant background is that most of my participants, and I say most because all of them but one or two, all of them but one transitioned to a center-based special education setting. So my idea going into my research was that I was going to find special education teachers that left, quit the field, or transitioned to general education. What I found was that through their struggles as a mild to moderate teacher, they transitioned to an effective needs program or an SSN program or an autism program because they felt like the strain of teaching academics on top of dealing with multiple disabilities in one classroom that wasn't set up for their success was too difficult. So when they switched to a center-based classroom, the systems in place or the support level looked different, and they found that that transition was a better option than staying in the mild to moderate setting. All of my participants were licensed through an alternative program except for one. One of my participants went the traditional route. She came from a background of education, And she knew what she was getting into, so she went the traditional route for her licensure. Every other participant in my research study went through an alternative program. They did student teaching through the alternative program here in the state of Colorado. All of them were licensed through Colorado. To talk about their backgrounds a little bit more, 40% of them that I interviewed were still considering transitioning to new roles in education, while the other 60% plan to stay in their current positions. They cited a teacher on special assignment, so a TOSA job where you would be probably a dean of students or in charge of a different program in secondary, as a position they would consider transitioning to. They considered administrative roles, but when they thought about administration roles, it looked different for a lot of them because they had to make the decision of, do I go for a special education certification in administration or do I go for a principal certification? And for special education, that's two very distinctly different paths. And a lot of them were on the fence about it, so they kind of just stood still in where they were and haven't pursued further education. And almost all of them would prefer to teach secondary, except for I think one of my participants cited that she likes teaching middle school and she would like to stay teaching middle school. But most of my participants did say they would prefer to teach in a secondary setting because the student population looks different and the challenges that you face at work are different. 20% of my participants had 2 to 5 years of experience, and the other 80% had between 6 and 7 years. So to my data collection, I did a semi-structured in-depth interview with all 5 participants. I collected demographic surveys. I followed a structured guide that focused on participants' experiences, challenges, and motivations. The expected time for my interviews was 60 to 90 minutes. Most of my interviews went between an hour and 2 hours, depending on my participants. So my research question 1 looked at what factors contribute to special education settings, what personal factors contribute to special education teachers leaving the mild to moderate needs classroom. The identified personal factors came out as burnout, emotional strain, and physical health impacts contributing to leaving the mild to moderate setting. Findings from previous research aligned with this because many teachers have reported similar factors in special education as a whole. Physical safety concerns, workplace stress and conflict, and limited decompression time were heavily cited in personal reasons why they left the mild to moderate setting. One of my participants experienced physical assault. Students broke her nose. She broke one of her hips. Another participant cited that there was physical trauma and broken bones in their hand. One of my participants cited that on a regular basis they were in that fight or flight crisis mode in what their school calls the blue room, which is a blue padded room that students go to when the concern is that they're going to hurt themselves. Workplace stress and conflict came out as another area of concern where participants face prolonged stress from workplace conflict leading to burnout and dissatisfaction. One of my participants cited, considering the fact that teachers have summer off, Christmas off, in one of the Pikes Peak districts you have a week in fall, just because that's when their break is, that this amount of downtime where you're not working isn't enough time to rebound from the stress that they carried home every day. One of my participants cited that they've had physical illness from working the long hours, or they develop migraines where they violently throw up for hours on end due to the stress from their position. So one of the major concerns that came out of my research was that the stress doesn't leave when they leave the job. They leave the job, they're still stressed. They go home, they work for 3 more hours trying to plan and implement solutions that will help in their classroom, which left them limited time to decompress and really kind of process through the emotional toll that they're taking in this position. So this table breaks out my major and minor findings. So for my research question 1, I had one major finding, which was burnout and emotional strain. 100% of my participants, every single one of them, talked about burnout and emotional stress in one way or another. 60% of them had physical health impairments that led them to end up seeking medical care, whether it be for a broken bone, a laceration, or mental health. Emotional fatigue from constant student-related demands was also something that was mentioned by every one of my participants. Role frustration and unrealistic expectations and work-life balance were my minor findings. Unmet personal aspirations, parental stress and unrealistic expectations from parents, frustration with their role. Not having a clear defined role in special education is something that came out as a minor factor because some of my participants coming into this field from an alternative license didn't have a full understanding on what they should focus on a day-to-day. If they have students that they're always reacting to behavior with, when are they finding time to address academics? So that came up with some of my participants, as well as difficulty compartmentalizing work and personal life, and challenges with maintaining that work and personal life balance. My second research question was what school factors contributed to teachers leaving the mild to moderate setting? Identified organizational issues, leadership failures, research gaps, school climate, and a lack of collaboration was a big factor for a lot of my participants. Previous findings support this and reported similar themes. Concerns about administrative support, where administrators promised things that they couldn't uphold, and then insufficient support for inclusion. Many of my participants felt they had to fight for the rights of their students against their school administration. And as a special education teacher, that was very difficult for a lot of my participants. One of my participants cited the mild to moderate classroom in special education as the redheaded stepchild. My participant said, special education is the redheaded stepchild. They stick us in the back of the building in the corner. They don't want to hear from us. They don't want to support us, and they don't want to see our kids. When we take our kids to go do things that general education teachers should be including in them, it's a fight. And I think that weighed heavily on a lot of my participants. One of my participants felt that the district they were working for was not legally taking care of students the way that they should. The 40 to 70% LRE means that 40 to 70% of their day, they're receiving services for special education, and the remainder of their day, they're with their general education setting. So 39% and below, that means generally those are your students that are in a center-based program for SSN, AN, or TAP. TAP is an autism program in one of the Pikes Peak districts. It is called a different name across the different districts. But cliques and divisions among different special education teachers and settings was a problem. One of my teachers stated that as a mild to moderate needs teacher, they never felt that they were supported, that their center-based teachers have their own clique and they only are concerned with students that are in their center-based programs. But if you have behavior concerns or you have a student in mild to moderate who has autism or an autism spectrum diagnosis and it impacts them in the school environment, they wouldn't receive support from their TAP teacher because that student wasn't center-based and that those teachers felt like that wasn't their student to work with. So some of my teachers cited that as a huge problem in understanding that all students with disabilities should have the same level of respect from teachers and special education teachers and administration, and they should have the same access to inclusion and inclusive activities in the school. But they felt like that wasn't what they were seeing in special education. And many of my participants in their interviews broke down to tears about things like this. These were things that heavily impacted them. So when you think about them all citing how they can't compartmentalize, it's because they're going home and they're thinking about the things that are unfair, that they're having to fight for their students that they feel like they should be inherently entitled to, rather than things that these teachers should have to fight for them. So my research question 2 had 2 major findings and 1 minor finding: leadership failures and resource gaps, and then school climate. So lack of administrative support. The resources aren't the same for special education teacher, and this is something that 60% of my participants noted. Special education in this district has its own funding, but the way that the resources are allocated are not the same. So when we look at a special education budget, we're also talking about our speech language pathologist and some of our other SSP service providers, and how the money for special education has to support those. They have to pay for their own testing booklets and their exam, their battery exam manuals. So that all comes out of the special education budget. Whereas your general education teachers will have a budget and they get to buy games and fun things for their classroom. Special education doesn't have that same leeway when it comes to the budget. So inadequate resources, both fiscally and then personally. When it comes to special education, a lot of my participants cited paraprofessionals as being problematic for their classrooms. Depending on the district that I looked at, depending on the way the resources for paraprofessionals were allocated. Some of the districts in the Pikes Peak region hire paraprofessionals only for center-based programs. So that'll be your SSN, your TAP, or your effective needs program, which means mild to moderate teachers will have a caseload of 37 students that they have to see with no paraprofessional support. Or they would hire inadequate paraprofessionals and they would spend more time coordinating adults to make sure they're doing their job as a paraprofessional than they could with direct time with students. So school climate and collaboration also, that was also part of kind of what led that to be a second major finding. Disengaged support staff falls into that paraprofessional view where they have paraprofessionals who are not supporting the way that they need them to support. The cliques in the special education departments. 40% of my participants cited a need for trauma-informed care and culture in the schools. When you teach in Title I schools, some districts, some principals, and it goes from the top down, look at trauma-informed learning practices. Meaning we treat every student with the idea that we don't know what they've gone through. Some of my teachers had students living in homeless shelters, and they would see how they were treated or how teachers would look at them differently because of where they were coming from, and their socioeconomic status. And they wouldn't treat them the same in special education without understanding that part of the reason why they may have these deficits is because they don't have a structured home life and they don't have access to everything that some of our more privileged or affluent communities have. So a need for a trauma-informed school culture starts from the top down, and many of my participants kind of touched on it in different ways. And then role frustration and unrealistic expectations. High caseloads has always been a problem in special education. There's a lot of research that supports high caseloads are a problem and a cause for turnover. But workload challenges for high caseloads, one of my participants cited as high as 47 students on their caseload with no paraprofessional support. That is a very difficult caseload to manage. Some districts you only have 10 kids, 13 kids. Other districts you'll have 30 on average. And it changes greatly across the special education settings. My third research question looked at societal factors. And this question went different ways depending on the participant and where they were mentally with their career and their experiences. Stigmas against special education fall under one of the really big systematic issues. Special education policies and systematic noncompliance. One of my participants said she has taught at 6 different schools and every school is doing special education illegally. She's never been in a school where they're systematically compliant with the laws of special education because the cards are stacked against her, and every school that she's been at, they don't have the resources, they don't have the manpower, they don't have the understanding of special education to fully service the students on their caseload. And if you consider teachers who have 47 students on their caseload with no paraprofessional support, and then you consider a teacher who has 10 to 13 kids on their caseload with no paraprofessional support, you can see that for the same pay, the expectation of work is so much higher, and the ability to be able to fully service your students, it becomes a lot more challenging the more students that you have. So systematic noncompliance is something that became frequently brought up in my research. Again, this kind of follows the trend of special education research. Overqualification of students for services. Some participants noted that the over-identification of students, particularly those with depression, anxiety, and ADHD, influence their decision to leave. One of my participants noted that every student that comes to the door with anxiety or depression or ADHD shouldn't qualify for special education. In the school districts, we have 504 accommodations. So if there is a need for accommodations for testing or in classroom where there is no demonstrated gap for academics, students shouldn't be automatically qualified for an IEP. But this participant felt that because there is a financial incentive for the schools to qualify students for special education, that schools are more likely to lean in favor of it. Or some parents push for, he noted that some parents push for a higher classification of special education so that they could get state benefits. For some students that are in center-based programs like SSN, TAP, or autism, if their parent is a caregiver, he noted that some of their motive to come to meetings for IEPs and push for their kid to be in a more restrictive environment was likely due to the financial incentives to the parent. So overclassification from a societal standpoint of labeling a student as special education for a specific learning disability or for autism, even though it's not impacting them greatly, was something that he saw heavily on his caseload, where he didn't feel that students always needed an IEP to get them through the school, that they could have accommodations, and when they're functioning in the 80th percentile, it's hard to classify them as special education, but was something that he faced on more than one occasion. Identifying clinical issues. Concerns that clinical problems are often recognized when students struggle with non-preferential tasks. So this was something I found really interesting that my participants mentioned. Special education students would be classified as SED for emotional disabilities, but when it was something that they wanted to do, they were very compliant, they were fine getting through the day. But the minute that it was something challenging or something they didn't want to do, my participant noted that that's when all of a sudden it was a disability. So his notion was a disability is a disability, you cannot turn it on and off. But he started to see an uptake in students that leaned into their disability as their anxiety is really bad when it comes to taking a test, or their anxiety is really bad when it comes to doing homework. So parents are pushing for students to have a reduction of work or a modification of their curriculum to better support these clinical diagnoses on the outside. So for my participants, the idea of overclassification of special education based on outside diagnosis was something that they found problematic. For my research question 3, there was 1 major and 2 minor themes, which was the societal stigma and policy changes, inclusion versus special education programs, and economic pressures and unrealistic expectations. I think the minor pushing for inclusion, clashing with the need for specialized program was something that, as it did fall into the category of minor based on participant responses, but for the participants that it impacted greatly. So a lot of my participants noted that across the board, they have students who they felt were not properly classified. And the way the district funding works, they felt played a role in that, and the way that the district doesn't want to call somebody center-based because then they have to provide transportation, was something that they cited as problematic for the field of special education. Implications for application. Support networks and mentorship were something that came up. When I talked to my participants about how do you think we could resolve some of these problems, we kind of talked about the 2-factor theory, where if something is wrong, we can't just throw a pizza party and pretend that it's not wrong by bribing our teachers or having teacher appreciation day. We have to put in structures that are going to help teachers understand their job, learn their job better, and we have to fix the systemic problems that are happening that are creating this dissatisfaction. So we can't fix dissatisfaction by just throwing bribes at our teachers. We have to find a way to fix the problems. So I started to ask my participants in my interviews, what do they think could fix these problems? Support networks and mentorship were mentioned. Strong mentorship from experienced teacher helps retain special education teachers. This is supported by a wealth of literature, but the districts that it's implemented in, and the participants I talked to that do have mentorship programs, cited that they had mentors at other schools. And how is a mentor at another school supposed to help them at the school that they're at? So pairing new teachers with mentors would foster that community and skill development, but they need to be within the same building. Leadership, impacts of administrative leadership. Every one of my participants stated that they did not have leadership support, and their lack of leadership support led to them leaving. One of my participants faced quite a few challenges from parents, and ultimately the leadership's inability to engage with parents to help their situation made it incredibly difficult for them to stay, which ultimately left them to leaving. Systematic challenges affecting retention. The high caseloads that I talked about previously, and the lack of resources. So if you have 47 kids, 37 kids, 27 kids, and no paraprofessional support, or paraprofessionals that are not comfortable with their position, it makes it incredibly difficult for teachers to maintain their positions and decide to stay every year. Burnout and emotional strain. Many of my teachers felt that their well-being was not acknowledged by administration. One of my participants noted that on a near daily basis, they were in fight or flight because they had combative students that were physically attacking them and assaulting them and touching them inappropriately. And their administration felt like that was part of the job. And when they signed up for special education, they knew that was part of the job. So my participants reflected on those instances and felt like, had there been some recognition of the struggles that they deal with every day in their classroom that nobody sees, because when they call for support, it's not an administrator coming, it's another paraprofessional, it's another special education teacher. Just acknowledgement of the challenges that they go through instead of receiving feedback that didn't feel like it supported what they went through on a daily basis, would have probably helped them feel more stable and suitable in their position. Addressing burnout systematically. So that trauma-informed care that I talked about previously and that trauma-informed approach, it starts at the top. It starts at the school administrators, and the school administrators have to carry that through all of their administration, all of their teachers, and through all of their administrative practices so that it trickles down to the teachers that are dealing one-on-one with the students. And then calls for equitable distribution of workloads to prevent burnout. Often schools distribute their caseload based on grades. So sometimes it'll be K through 2 and then 3 through 5. Some schools will distribute the workload every other, and then some schools will look at it every year and decide where the split is in the caseload. All of my participants said if they had a more manageable caseload, they likely wouldn't have felt the stress and the burnout that they did. I don't think any one of my participants mentioned or even hinted at the fact that they could go home after work and just not work. Every single participant mentioned that when they go home from work, they are practicing, they're prepping their lesson plans. They are researching behavior techniques depending on how much support they have from their school counselors or their other SSPs. But essentially, that workload contributes to them greatly spending a wealth of time outside of work, and it led to burnout for every single one of my participants. So my recommendations for further research, classification and structure of special education programs. I think an investigation of how school districts classify and structure their special education programs would be impactful for the field of special education. The fact that there is not a defined definition for the mild to moderate setting makes it difficult to really set teachers up to understand what that setting is going to look like. And partially this is because every student is unique. Every student in special education is unique. One student with autism is not going to look the same as another student who has autism. The things that you see in a special education classroom, they're not cookie cutter. They don't fit from class to class, and it makes it difficult to say, if you fit this box, you go in this one. When you look at specialized rooms like affective needs, the variety of students that are in there is different from school to school. And I found that with the mild to moderate setting. Student placement criteria and transitions. So exploring who establishes placement requirements and the criteria used for student support, I think, would also be beneficial. Because from every person I talked to in this research study, the way their district decides who is in what setting changed from district to district, and it was not the same across the board. So access transitions between program settings. So mild to moderate, when we look at the mild to moderate setting and how students have access to that, I think would be beneficial for special education. The impact of non-uniform technology, so examining how inconsistent terminology affects program implementation and teacher clarity. So when a teacher takes a role for mild to moderate, I think understanding exactly what mild to moderate entails and having precise terminology. I found it very difficult in my research to clearly define each setting. A lot of published research identifies special education based on that least restrictive environment. So you have students who are in the general education class 80% of the time, students who are there 40 to 70% of the time, and students who are there less than 39% of their day. In most of the research that I examined, I did not see mild to moderate setting. I did not see SSN. I did not see autism. I saw categories based on LRE. And at first, I kind of found this daunting, I would say. But as I worked through different districts through my own research, I realized why. It's because we don't have one uniform technology or uniform terminology for each setting in the special education field. And then language and special education classification. I think research exploring the relationship between students' first language and special education placement would be really important. So when I say student first language looks at how we're talking about students. We don't want to say a student, an autistic student. We don't point at students and go, that student's autistic. Because when we as special education teachers, you hardly ever will hear special education teachers reference students like this. But a lot of times my participants mentioned general education teachers would talk about students like this. They would talk negatively about students and their disabilities amongst each other. So I think examining how teachers talk to each other, how teachers talk to their spouses or their friends about students in different disability categories, and whether they use student first language. So as I was saying, we don't say an autistic student. We say a student who has ASD, a student has SED, a student that qualifies under SLD. When we start labeling students by their disability rather than labeling them as a student first who has a disability, I think it impacts how we look at students. And inherently, I think it impacts how teachers talk about students, especially when you think about categories like autism or social emotional disability. So if we're looking at students that have a social emotional disability and that's how we're categorizing them, that's how we're seeing them. And changing the way that we talk can change how we act as educators. So I think a study that looks at how teachers' interactions are with their student based on their student first language and approach to a student first language would be really beneficial for the field of special education. I'll open it up to any questions. All right. Well, thank you guys for coming.
Could you talk a little bit more about that last, the relationship between first language and special education? So that's an area that you see needs to be researched more.
I do. I think student first language is really important. When we look at special education, I have my own children, and I think about my own children, and I think if my daughter had ADHD and she went to school and the teachers were like, oh, you know, little Susie with ADHD, and that's how they talked about my child, rather than saying, well, little Susie's behaviors sometimes reflect in her getting out of her seat, her touching other children. With students with autism, we see a lot of the times personal space and understanding of other people's emotions. So you'll have teachers who will, in general education, look at students and say, oh, he's autistic. That's why he does that. He's not autistic. He is a student with autism. And that difference in verbiage, that difference in how we talk about students, shapes how we treat students. So little Susie who can't keep her hands to herself isn't autistic, and that's not why she can't do it. Little Susie hasn't yet learned the skills to keep her hands to herself because we haven't taught it to her. And that's a failure on our part, not on her part. But when we talk about her as little Susie with autism, we start to see how we're saying your disability is why you're like that. Not that we haven't taught you enough yet within your disability category. So I think if research was done in the field of special education on how teachers reference students and whether they think student first or disability first. And in special education, it's in the school that I went to for my degree, they teach you that student first piece. They teach you they're a student with disabilities, not a disabled student. And that when you think about working with students with disabilities, that's how you have to look at them. You have to look at them as every other child. They deserve everything that every other child deserves. And you have to teach them that with their disabilities, they can still do everything everyone else can. They just need access to it. They need to learn the skills, and they learn differently. So,
What does that have to do with first language?
oh, not first language, I'm sorry, that's a typo on my end. So it should be student first language instead of students first language. So first, instead of thinking students first language as in whether they speak English or ELL, which also, in all honesty, is something interesting for special education, because special education and ELL, sometimes students will get classified as a special education student if they are an English language learner, because you can't identify, I don't want to say you can't. I'll say schools have sometimes difficulty identifying if it's a language barrier or if it's a special education need. So in all honesty, it is a typo on my end, but their first language probably has an impact on where they're classified in the special education. I'll say, for instance, I had a student who I worked with who was labeled as intellectually disabled. That was his special education category. After working with him for some time, it wasn't a language barrier. It wasn't an intellectual disability. It was a language barrier. He didn't have access because he spoke another language first. He came over here from another country, and his school before us classified him as intellectually disabled because they felt like they couldn't get what they needed on his evaluations to support a specific learning disability, and he didn't have any other outside diagnosis. So in all honesty, that's something I've seen in special education too, is that students who are English language learners or ELL students or multiple language learners, sometimes they get classified as special education. And I do think that would be another interesting study to look at.
I taught in Manassas 40 years ago, and I know it happens.
Mm-hmm.
I know it happens all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know if it still happens. I've been away for a while. I suspect it.
I would say, based on my experience, it does. So in the districts that I've looked at, your school psychologist does the battery testing to see if a student would be considered intellectually disabled. And then your special education teachers look at whether they would fall into a specific learning disability. And I will say from my own experience and then my participants' interviews, that overclassification piece definitely plays a role in students' language. If they have a language barrier, your MLL or multiple language learner teachers have tests that clearly define, is it language or is it special education? But sometimes there's a little bit of both in there. So they'll lean on the side of caution and they'll classify as special education until we can truly determine that.
I guess I don't know the terminology that well. So mild to moderate, say I'm a teacher,
Mm-hmm.
and I have a caseload of 30 students. Are they coming in at different times of the day? Do I have them in a classroom all at once?
So that depends on the classification. So
Mild to moderate.
mild to moderate would be generally, in a lot of districts, it is students who are 80% and above, which means they spend 80% of their day in the general education setting. So they have a deficiency in reading, writing, or math, generally. And the mild to moderate teacher will pull them based on what is agreed upon in their IEP, which is your legally binding document that says this student has a disability. We're going to service the disability based on XYZ criteria and minutes. And they'll, during what they call small group time, where the teacher breaks the students up into small groups for their needs, those students will go to the special education classroom.
Okay, all at the same time?
Well, generally the caseloads are split somewhat evenly. Like in this study, most of mine had a clear caseload split. So it'd be K through 2 would be one teacher, and then 3 through 5 would be another. If they're at the secondary, if they're in high school, it looks completely different, and same thing with middle school. But at the elementary level, generally your special education teachers will pull their 5 to 10 kids. They'll break them into groups based on their needs, and they'll work on those deficits. Because in the mild to moderate setting, you have a lot of students who are considered SLD, or they have the disability category of specific learning disability. And that specific learning disability, when they get classified, says that there is a gap of at least 2 grades. So you may have a 5th grader who is reading at a 1st grade level, or you may have a 5th grader at a 3rd grade level. These are all students that generally fall into mild to moderate. But depending on the district, some of these mild to moderate students, they have emotional struggles. They struggle to regulate their emotions. And a lot of my participants noted that they had violent physical altercations with students. One of my participants noted that their principal was physically attacked and had to seek emergency services because they were attacked by a student on their caseload. Another one of my participants noted that this was a secondary teacher, so high school, noted that the school had to call the cops on one of their students because they were trashing a classroom and running around vandalizing and hurting other students. So for them, that was a mild to moderate setting. But in other districts, those students might have been placed in what's considered a BOCES school, so an alternative education school, or they might be placed in a center-based program. It really just depends on how the district chooses to manage how they differentiate the special education setting.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem that someone got a broken nose. How can that be?
That's mild to moderate, right? And that's part of the reason why these teachers left. But surprisingly, the teachers that left mild to moderate, they went into the subcategories of affective needs or the subcategories of autism or SSN, where they could look at one field of special education, one field of need, and really be a specialist on that.
Were the caseload smaller in that case?
Oftentimes, your center-based programs are a lot smaller because your students have a one-to-one need. So the district doesn't provide a one-to-one para, but if you have 8 kids in a classroom, you might have 6 paras in yourself. So there is a smaller ratio because the need for support is higher. And in all the teachers that I talk to, and even the one that is at an administrative level, they decide how much support you get based on how many minutes are on the student's IEP. So if a student's 39 and below, and they're spending almost all of their time in special education, and they only go out to have recess with their class or lunch with their class in the lunchroom, they have a higher need of support. And it's supported in that IEP document. So then we have to staff according to that higher need of support. And that's kind of what I found interesting across the different districts. Is some districts are like, you don't need a paraprofessional to service these 47 kids. But in other districts, they're like, no, we would never. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you guys all for coming. I appreciate your time. You guys have a good night.